"This is my ex-husband," replied another female voice, which Ethan immediately recognized. Turning his head, he saw Samantha striding purposefully toward his table. Ethan's first thought was, what now? What does she want this time? Samantha stopped a few steps from the table, her expression unusually serious. "I know you probably can't stand me," she began hesitantly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "But can we talk for a minute?" Ethan placed the remains of his sandwich aside and slid his sunglasses off, a habit his mother had ingrained in him long ago, believing it showed respect to let people see your eyes. "I don't hate you, Samantha," he said quietly, though he could feel the tension ratchet up with every passing moment. As he spoke, Ethan noticed her group of friends sitting nearby, clearly within earshot. If he raised his voice, they'd hear every word. Whatever she wanted to say, it wasn't meant for others. He gestured to the bench across from him. "Have a seat." Samantha sighed dramatically before perching on the bench, crossing one leg casually over the backrest, a move that felt less apologetic and more like a power play. "I really lost control for a while," she admitted, her tone feigning remorse. Ethan remained silent. From his perspective, that was putting it mildly. Samantha's actions had upended his life, but he wasn't about to revisit old grievances. She already knew exactly how he felt. There was a pause, during which Samantha removed her sunglasses, revealing the green eyes he once found captivating, though now they seemed to glint with something more calculating. "How are you, Ethan?" she asked, breaking the silence. "I'm doing well, thanks," he replied flatly, his tone betraying little interest. "And you?" "I'm good," Samantha said, clearly trying to sound upbeat. "I'm in evening school now. Dad probably mentioned it. I know he talks to you sometimes. I'm planning to apply to Texas University next semester. I want to be a doctor's assistant." "That's great," Ethan said, forcing a polite response, though his lack of enthusiasm was obvious. "I'm glad things are working out for you." He truly didn't care. Whatever direction Samantha's life was taking, it was no longer his concern. He wasn't her cheerleader or her sounding board anymore. "Listen, Ethan," Samantha said, leaning forward like she was about to deliver a heartfelt revelation. "I know I never said this during all the chaos, but I'm really sorry for what I did. I regret it more than I can even explain. I don't blame you for anything you're going through, but I hope someday you'll find a way to forgive me." Ethan cut her off before she could spiral into self-pity. "Samantha, I don't hate you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I've already forgiven you. Hatred isn't something I can carry. It would eat me alive and leave me with nothing. Anger like that poisons everything else in life, and I just don't have time for it. Life, as they say, is too short." "Well, thank you for saying that," Samantha said, though her tone made it clear she expected more. She launched into a monologue about her journey to self-improvement, rattling off details about seeing a psychologist and how she was finally facing the consequences of her choices. Ethan nodded occasionally, but couldn't help frowning as he shifted uncomfortably on the hard bench. Samantha caught his expression and immediately grew defensive. "What?" she snapped, a sharp edge creeping into her voice. "I'm trying to apologize here, Ethan, and show you that I'm working on myself." Ethan took a breath, struggling to keep his frustration in check. "Samantha, it feels like your psychologist is just stringing you along and draining your dad's wallet," he said bluntly. "If all this progress means you're just learning to say sorry without understanding why, then what's the point?" Her eyes narrowed, but Ethan pressed on. "Look, maybe this is just the first step for you, and there's still a lot of work left to do. But let me explain something," he said, choosing his words carefully. "When you say you won't do something because of the consequences, you're really just playing a game of risk management. It's like saying, 'I won't do this because I don't want to get caught.' That's not honesty, Samantha. That's fear." Samantha's face hardened, her irritation plain as day, but Ethan didn't stop. "I read somewhere that real honesty is doing the right thing even when no one's watching. Until you get to a place where you avoid bad choices because they're wrong, not because you're afraid of what might happen, you're just waiting to make the same mistakes all over again. You'll tell yourself it's a special circumstance or that the consequences don't apply this time." Samantha exhaled sharply, as if holding back a retort. Though she looked annoyed, there was a flicker of something in her expression. Perhaps she was starting to grasp his point. "For me," Ethan said softly, "it's simple. We're all human, and every single day, we're tempted by something. But if you can't instinctively turn away from temptation without thinking about it or analyzing the risks, then sooner or later, it's bound to end in disaster. Ethan concluded, his tone sharp. Samantha's jaw tightened as she glared at him, clearly ready to explode. Well, I guess I'm just not as perfect as some people, she snapped, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She leaned back, visibly trying to put distance between them. But just as quickly as her anger flared, her expression softened. Samantha shook her head and took a deep, deliberate breath before exhaling slowly. I loved you, Ethan, she said, shifting gears abruptly. Her voice carried a note of vulnerability. Believe it or not, I really loved you. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He could feel his own anger bubbling to the surface. And I loved you too, Samantha, he replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. I proved it every single day by staying loyal to you, by never betraying you. Samantha wrinkled her brow, her gaze darting away. But she wasn't about to let him have the last word. And telling my mom, dad, brothers, sisters, and everyone we knew about it. That's your idea of love? She retorted bitterly. Ethan let out a short, derisive laugh. Isn't that like blaming the victim? He shot back. All I did was shine a light on the mess you and those clowns created. It's like lifting a rock and watching all the slimy little creatures scramble for cover. And you know what? That's on you, not me. Samantha's face twisted into a scowl. Ethan clenched his jaw but forced himself to take a deep breath, relaxing his shoulders. He continued, his voice now calmer, but no less pointed. As for how it all went down, he said earnestly, I simply followed your lead. Samantha frowned, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. It was clear she hadn't expected him to take this approach. Ethan's gaze was steely as he reminded her of something she had once confessed. You told me yourself. You did it because you could. Because it was fun. You never stopped to think about my feelings. Not once. You didn't even care about what I was going through, did you? Her head lowered, and for a moment, Samantha was silent. Ethan felt a familiar exhaustion creep over him. This conversation, dredging up old wounds, had drained him. With a sigh, he put his sunglasses back on, stretched his arms, and stood up. Samantha, maybe I shouldn't have brought all this up, he said, his voice weary. It just crossed my mind. I suppose your psychologist will eventually lead you toward unpacking all this anyway. I hope I didn't ruin her plans. He took a step back, ready to leave, but then stopped and turned to face her one last time. You know, he said quietly, I really did love you, more than anything, but you burned it all away in one day. Every feeling I ever had for you, it's all gone. Now all I have is the memory of loving you. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry things ended like this. Without waiting for a reply, Ethan turned abruptly and walked away. His long strides carried him toward the gates leading to the open prairie, where his small Cessna plane was parked. As he passed a trash can, he tossed away the remnants of his sandwich, suddenly uninterested in finishing it. Even the slice of pecan pie, once his favorite, seemed tasteless now. Later, he'd regret throwing it away, but at that moment, all he wanted was to get as far away from Samantha as possible. Ethan had no clear idea of what he wanted to do next in life, but one thing was certain. Flying would always be part of his future. Determined to rekindle his passion for aviation, he took refresher courses to renew his pilot's license. This included extensive instrument ground training and hours of flight time with an instructor to hone his skills. 6 years earlier, Uncle Frank, his mother's older brother and the man who first taught him how to fly, had passed away, leaving his entire estate to Ethan's mom. Among the inheritance were 5 small airplanes parked behind the old north barn, located 3/4 of a mile from the house. Determined to restore them, Ethan hired 3 skilled aircraft mechanics, paying them generously for their time and expertise. Their task was straightforward: get all 5 planes up to FAA airworthiness standards. The mechanics, thrilled with the generous pay structure, worked efficiently and found they still had time left to tinker with Ethan's planes. Within weeks, all 5 single-engine airplanes passed inspection, and Ethan began selling them off to dealers. However, one plane caught the attention of a fellow private pilot, a man who, like Ethan, wanted to fly more often but couldn't afford the steep rental fees. Seeing something of himself in the man, Ethan offered a particularly favorable deal. Though he didn't make much money from the sales, he hadn't expected to. What mattered to Ethan was preserving Uncle Frank's legacy while finding peace in the skies. By the end of it, only one airplane remained in his possession, a plane he had no intention of selling. That aircraft became his sanctuary. Whenever life felt overwhelming, he'd take it up for an hour or two, alone in the vast expanse of the sky. One scorching August afternoon, Ethan sat at a picnic table beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient pecan tree. The shade offered a brief respite from the relentless Texas sun, and the tree stood near an old, weathered building that had seen better days. A modest sign on the building read James, but for the locals who frequented the spot, no further explanation was necessary. James was an elderly African-American man whose weathered appearance made it seem as though he had been liberated by Sherman's cavalry during their march east from Atlanta. No one knew exactly how old he was, but it didn't matter. James served barbecue so exceptional that it could rival any culinary masterpiece in the world. The locals and a select few from town were among the lucky ones who knew of this hidden gem. Despite the relentless midday heat, sitting beneath the expansive branches of the towering pecan tree was surprisingly pleasant. A gentle breeze swept through the shade, and the faint tendrils of fragrant smoke curling up from the smoker out back were enough to make anyone's mouth water from miles away. Though the building itself looked aged and abandoned, inside and out, it was immaculate, so spotless you could almost eat off the floor. Ethan visited as often as he could, especially since James' place was conveniently located along the best route between the city and his family's old home, now his. Adjusting to the fact that the house was entirely his now had been challenging, and on some days, the weight of that reality felt heavier than others. Today, however, Ethan wasn't passing through. He wasn't in transit to anywhere in particular. He had simply flown Uncle Frank's old Cessna 172 out to James' place because he was craving some of that legendary Texas brisket. Finishing off a huge brisket sandwich with sauce still dripping from the edges, Ethan gazed toward the distant horizon, where faint silhouettes of hills rippled against the shimmering heat waves. His mind wandered as he stared, thinking about the twists and turns his life had taken over the past few years. Plates of borracho beans and mustard potato salad sat nearby, half-eaten. He debated heading back inside for one of James' famous pecan pies, convincing himself that with his active lifestyle, an extra slice wouldn't hurt. Lost in his thoughts, Ethan barely registered the world around him. The occasional car rattling down the cracked two-lane road caught his peripheral vision, and he noted the wavy mirage of heat rising from the asphalt. He vaguely noticed several cars pulling into the dusty parking lot, carrying groups of young people, but he didn't think much of it. Fragments of conversation from a nearby table broke through his reverie. "Are you really going to approach that cowboy?" asked an unfamiliar female voice, tinged with amusement. Ethan instinctively tensed. The comment made him self-conscious, though his attire was nothing out of the ordinary for rural Texas. Worn shorts, a faded shirt, sturdy boots, and a cream-colored Stetson. His first thought, as he adjusted his hat, was that it wasn't exactly cowboy attire. It was just practical for the heat and dust. When Ethan had first considered flying to James' place to avoid the winding, endless Texas roads, he'd looked up the owner of the nearby pasture where he wanted to land. The county tax records listed a woman as the landowner, but he hadn't been able to locate her. Deciding to leave the matter unresolved, he'd simply started using the stretch of open prairie as a makeshift airstrip, figuring he'd apologize and stop if she ever raised a complaint. The barbed wire fence separating James' plot from the prairie was punctuated by 15-foot galvanized gates, likely installed years ago for cattle loading. The hinges and locks had rusted over time, but Ethan, feeling a sense of responsibility for his frequent landings, had spent an entire day fixing them. By replacing the rusted parts, he'd restored the gates so they swung smoothly and latched securely. The effort had been oddly therapeutic, helping to ease the weight of his past. Now, as Ethan walked toward his plane, ready to take to the skies and leave his troubles behind, he spotted a woman leaning casually against the newly repaired gates. She was slender, with jet-black hair and a warm, caramel complexion that glowed in the sunlight. Ethan approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Hello there," he said, introducing himself. The woman turned toward him, and he was immediately struck by her stunning crystal blue eyes, which twinkled playfully beneath the brim of her sunglasses. "What a funny little plane," she remarked, her lips curling into a teasing smile. Ethan chuckled at her tone. "It might look funny," he replied with a shrug, "but it flies straight and gets me where I need to go a lot faster than a car ever could." Ethan couldn't hold back his smile as they chatted effortlessly about the plane, the open skies, barbecue, and whatever else popped into their minds. He felt proud of himself for managing to keep up an intelligent conversation with such a stunning woman. "Are you a pilot?" she asked, tilting her head inquisitively. "Yes," he confirmed with a nod. "Well, you don't exactly look like one," she remarked, giving him a playful once-over. Ethan grinned. "That's because my pilot's suit is at the dry cleaners, right next to Superman's cape and Batman's cowl," he joked. She laughed, reaching out to playfully slap his hand, her touch lingering just enough to make Ethan wonder who had leaned closer, her or him. Her touch was gentle, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan found himself wanting more. "Do you want to go for a ride?" he asked, his voice brimming with anticipation, hoping for a yes. "A ride? You mean in that little plane?" she teased, her tone sweet but with a hint of mischief. "Well, that's quite the offer, cowboy." Ethan couldn't help but feel his heart race. Did this mean she was thinking the same thing he was? The way her lips curved into a half-smile made him hope so. "Of course," he replied confidently, sensing an opening. "I've got a Mustang parked at the ranch. We could be there in 20 minutes by plane, and I'll take you for a ride once we land." She locked eyes with him for a moment, as if considering his proposal. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the group of young people who had arrived earlier, apparently her friends. "Julie," she shouted at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying across the parking lot. Ethan thought to himself that her voice could probably reach truck drivers a mile away. A petite brunette with a full figure emerged from the crowd, tossing a leather clutch toward her. It landed a few feet away, and the woman strode over to retrieve it. Her movements were deliberate, almost feline. Ethan watched as she picked up the purse, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. "Clara? Hey, it's Sierra. Guess what? I'm flying on a plane with a cowboy," she said, her tone playful but also casual. "Yeah, on his plane. We're going to his ranch." Ethan listened with growing curiosity. So, her name was Sierra. But who was Clara? He wondered if Clara was a friend, a sister, or someone more significant. "Yes, it's fine," Sierra continued, glancing at Ethan with a smile that sent his pulse racing. "He's really sweet, don't worry." "No, you don't know him." Picking up on the worry in the other person's voice, Ethan walked closer and smiled reassuringly, pulling out his wallet to show Sierra his pilot's license. "Clara, enough chattering already," Sierra said irritably, rolling her eyes as she ended the call. "She's not my mom, but sometimes she acts like it," she explained to Ethan with an exasperated shrug. Ethan nodded, though he couldn't help feeling a flicker of unease. Why did Sierra need to share so much of his information with her roommate? Shaking off the thought, he focused on the moment instead. "So, if I got this right," Ethan said as he started the plane's engine, "your full name is Mercedes?" "Sierra Ismail Madistli." "Yeah, but everyone calls me Sierra. Would it be okay if I called you Mercedes?" Ethan asked, testing her reaction. She didn't respond directly, but her silence seemed to signal she didn't mind. He handed her the headphones as he completed the pre-flight system check, doing his best to push away lingering doubts about the phone call. The Cessna lifted off smoothly, rising into the endless Texas sky. Ethan made a wide circle over James' barbecue spot, flying low enough for Sierra's friends to spot them. From the passenger seat, Sierra waved enthusiastically at the group, her energy lighting up the cockpit. Ethan smiled at her joy and pulled the plane into another loop so her friends could see her clearly. Once they leveled off and headed south, Ethan relaxed slightly, finding comfort in the steady hum of the engine and Sierra's presence beside him. "You know," Ethan began, glancing her way, "you're the first Latina I've ever met with blue eyes." "No offense." Sierra turned to him, shooting a playful but sharp look. "None taken, cowboy," she replied, her voice carrying a teasing lilt. "But let's not pretend you've met that many Latinas, huh?" Ethan chuckled, conceding the point. There was something about her, a spark, a vitality, that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. He had no idea where this flight might lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like the weight of his past was truly behind him. With a quick glance, Sierra remarked playfully, "I'm not Latina, and I don't speak Spanish," her lips curling into a slight frown. Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I apologize," he said, watching her carefully. "I didn't mean to offend you." For a second, she looked at him with faint disdain, but then her face lit up with laughter. "Relax, cowboy. You're in the presence of a true Cheyenne woman. The Cheyenne people are Native Americans." Ethan studied her face, taking in her striking features, then smiled. "All right, Miss Cheyenne Warrior. For a historical project, I once read journals about Native Americans from the early 18th century. I don't recall any mention of Cheyenne women with blue eyes." He paused to check the instruments, gesturing towards the horizon, before continuing with a teasing tone. "So let's be honest. Your Cheyenne warriors must have some Celtic blood in there somewhere." Sierra stuck out her tongue, but smiled. "Maybe I've got a little Irish in me," she quipped. Ethan nodded with mock seriousness. "Ah, so your dad must have been charmed by a wandering Irish lass, roaming the wilds. Let me guess, the wilds of Cheyenne, Wyoming." "Wrong," she replied coolly. "Philadelphia. And according to my mom, she ambushed the poor wandering Cheyenne warrior, captured him fair and square, and decided to keep him." Ethan burst out laughing, picturing the lively banter between her parents. "I think I'd have enjoyed sitting down with them for coffee and hearing all about that. Sounds like my kind of conversation." Later, the topic turned to Ethan's ex-wife, Samantha. When Sierra asked about her, Ethan shared a little about the circumstances of their divorce and their recent conversation at James' barbecue spot. He explained that he had compartmentalized those memories, locking them away in a corner of his mind. To him, Samantha was now just another face in a crowd, someone he'd moved on from completely. Sierra tilted her head thoughtfully. "Funny you mention her," she said. "Carly, my second cousin, who invited Clara and me to Texas, works with Samantha. They're not exactly close, though." Ethan raised his eyebrows, chuckling. "Small world, huh?" He seemed relieved to change the subject, and was soon telling Sierra how he had learned to fly. He spoke about Uncle Frank, who had taught him the basics of piloting and overseen his first solo flight when he was just 15. Their conversation was so lively that time flew by unnoticed. Ethan remained focused on flying, but his gaze kept drifting back to the beautiful Cheyenne woman sitting beside him. There was something captivating about her, something that made him feel lighter than he had in years. Before he realized it, the ranch appeared on the horizon. Adjusting his course, Ethan steered the Cessna toward the well-worn patch of prairie that served as his runway. As they descended, he explained to Sierra the importance of flying into the wind and the difference between windward and leeward sides. With a sharp right turn, Ethan lined up the old plane and brought it down for a perfect landing on its three-wheel gear. They taxied to a large barn, where tie-down straps and chocks were stored. Ethan and Sierra worked together to secure the plane against the strong Texas winds, which were known to sweep across the vast prairie without warning. Sierra pitched in enthusiastically, laughing as Ethan explained the process, and before long, they had the plane locked down. "This way," Ethan said, leading her through a wide passageway on the side of the barn. Emerging on the other side, Sierra spotted the house about 100 yards away. She pointed toward it, raising an eyebrow. "Okay, so where's this Mustang you promised me?" "Oh, there she is," Ethan said, abruptly changing direction and heading toward a pen where a small herd of horses gathered by the fence. The horses perked up at the sight of him, expecting treats. Ethan grinned. "Here she is," he said, pointing to a 3-year-old chestnut filly prancing around in the pen as if she knew she was the center of attention. "Hey, Ginger," Ethan called out, extending his hand. The horse trotted over, sniffing his palm in search of something sweet. Ethan turned to Sierra with a grin. "Allow me to introduce you to Ginger. Ginger, this is Miss Sierra Shen, warrior princess, all-around wonderful person, and now your new acquaintance. Ginger tossed her head and snorted, while Sierra struggled to stifle a laugh. What? Ethan asked, his tone tinged with mock indignation. What's so funny? Ethan looked at Sierra in bewilderment, completely clueless about what he'd done to make her laugh so much. Her radiant smile seemed to brighten everything around her, and he found himself unable to take his eyes off her. A flicker of anxiety hit him, and he nervously checked his zipper to make sure nothing was amiss. Still giggling, Sierra shook her head. No, it's not that. I thought you were talking about a Mustang car, not a horse, she explained, her laughter bubbling over. Ethan chuckled at the mix-up, then shared the story of his first Mustang, a wild one he'd caught in Nevada years ago. I'd love to see you riding her, he said, his voice softening, galloping across the prairie, your hair flying in the wind. Sierra es mirquez. Oh, don't worry, cowboy. This Cheyenne maiden knows her way around a horse, she teased. I spent summers learning to ride with my grandfather. Ethan's grin widened, but Sierra's next comment tempered his excitement. She pointed out that riding in her shorts wouldn't be comfortable, and she had no intention of chafing her legs. Ethan immediately agreed, not wanting her smooth, cream-colored thighs to suffer. After a moment of thought, he suggested a drive across the prairies instead. Sierra agreed, giving him an approving pat on the chest. Ethan couldn't help but note how natural it felt to be around her, her presence filling the air with warmth and lightness. They stopped at the old family house, now his, where Ethan loaded a few bottles of water into his Range Rover. Together, they set off across the vast prairie that stretched far beyond the boundaries of his ranch. These lands were unclaimed, and Ethan often let his cattle graze there freely. Soon, they passed his herd, lazily making their way toward a watering hole. As they drove, Ethan told Sierra about the history of the region, the ancient ruins scattered across the landscape, and the herds of bison that once roamed these plains. She listened intently, her eyes shining with curiosity. I'll take you to see those ruins someday, Ethan promised, catching her gaze. When they returned to the house, the prairie was draped in long shadows as the sun dipped low in the sky. Ethan showed Sierra the place where he'd grown up, walking her through the house where he'd spent his teenage years and the fields where he used to run as a boy. Memories swept over him, and he marveled at how much his life had changed since then. As they stopped at the main house, Ethan turned off the engine and looked at Sierra, his heart racing. He took a deep breath before speaking. Sierra, I don't want to take you back to the city, he admitted. I feel so good with you here, but I don't want you to feel like a captive. The decision is yours. Sierra studied him carefully, her expression thoughtful. What do you want? She asked softly. Ethan didn't hesitate. I want to light the grill and cook you a steak dinner. Maybe throw in a salad, he said, his voice full of quiet hope. She considered his words for a moment, then smiled. Slowly, she took out her phone and dialed a number. Clara? Hey, it's Sierra. I'm staying at the ranch tonight. Maybe longer, she informed her roommate, glancing at Ethan as she spoke. After ending the call, Sierra turned to him with a serious expression. Cowboy, she said with mock gravity. Can we go inside so I can find that lovely bathroom you showed me earlier? Of course, Ethan replied, grinning as he reached for the door handle. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he shouted, Last one to the bathroom has to wait. He bolted for the house, laughing as Sierra let out an indignant cry and fumbled with the door handle in pursuit. They raced up the porch steps, Sierra grabbing at his arm to slow him down, but Ethan's size and strength gave him the advantage. He reached the downstairs bathroom first, slapping the doorframe in victory. Upstairs, Sierra slammed the door of the large bathroom shut. Ladies first, she shouted teasingly, leaving Ethan laughing at her quick wit and thinking how his mother would have approved. After freshening up, they began preparing dinner together. Ethan preferred cooking outdoors on the grill, while Sierra took charge of the salad and vinaigrette sauce. The kitchen filled with a sense of easy camaraderie as they brushed hips while passing by each other and exchanged playful touches, a pat on the shoulder here, a nudge there. The steak sizzled over the coals as Ethan tended to the grill, and Sierra brought out plates, cutlery, and her perfectly prepared salad to the terrace. Every so often, they shared glances and light banter, the growing warmth between them undeniable. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he had shared such a simple, joyful moment with someone. It wasn't just the meal or the conversation, it was her. Sierra brought a spark of life back into his quiet world, and from the way she smiled at him, he could tell she felt it too. When it was time to eat, Sierra set their plates next to each other rather than across the table. As they sat side by side, laughing and savoring the meal, Ethan realized just how special this moment was. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, with Sierra by his side, he felt more at peace than he had in years. As dusk settled around them, Ethan and Sierra sat in companionable silence, quietly talking about nothing in particular. Their conversation meandered through light-hearted topics, small observations, and playful banter. Just two people getting to know each other. Despite having only met hours ago, they felt an easy, unspoken connection. Their exchanges flowed effortlessly, and now and then, their hands or arms would brush in subtle, unintentional touches that neither seemed to mind. After clearing the table and loading the dishwasher, they moved to two lounge chairs Ethan had set up on the terrace. He positioned them closer together than usual, leaving only a few centimeters between them, and Sierra hadn't objected. They reclined under the vast Texas sky, inventing names for constellations they couldn't recognize and laughing as they speculated whether the silvery streaks above were space stations or UFOs. The truth didn't matter. It was just an excuse to linger together. When the evening air grew cooler, they gathered their things and headed back to the house. At the door, Sierra suddenly stopped, hesitating as she turned to face Ethan. I'm not sure. I've never done this on a first date, she said softly, her gaze locking onto his. Ethan felt his heart race. That's okay, he said gently. Maybe don't think of it as a first date. The rest of the evening unfolded naturally, an unspoken charge in the air as they grew closer. Later, they went to bed, their emotions simmering just beneath the surface, each moment electric with unspoken intensity. The next morning, the house came alive with the aroma of sizzling bacon and scrambled eggs. They laughed as they made breakfast together, adding toast and jam to the table. Over the meal, Ethan learned that Sierra claimed to be part of a North American Meat Eaters Association, a group he'd never heard of. What, like a club for steak enthusiasts? Ethan teased as she polished off the last piece of bacon on the plate. Sierra grinned mischievously, shrugging. Something like that. I guess I'm just a true predator at heart. Ethan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Well, considering how you devoured that steak last night, I believe it. In response, Sierra sat on his lap and kissed him, leaving him grinning like a love-struck teenager. It had been years since he felt this kind of light-hearted happiness. After breakfast, Sierra, wearing only one of Ethan's oversized t-shirts, called Clara to check in, while Ethan pulled on his jeans and boots to take care of a few chores around the property. He emptied the trash into the fire pit behind the shed and swept out the stables. Returning to the house, he grabbed a soda from the fridge and realized with sudden clarity how he could keep his promise to get Sierra on horseback. "Mom's stuff," he exclaimed. "What about it?" Sierra asked, raising an eyebrow. "She left her old riding clothes here," Ethan explained. He filled her in on the situation with the ranch and suggested she try on his mom's jeans for horseback riding. Sierra eagerly followed him upstairs, rummaging through the closet while Ethan decided to video call his mom for permission. The connection crackled to life. "Hello, dear," his mom greeted warmly. "I was just thinking about you. How are you?" Ethan took a deep breath, ready to explain the unexpected events of the past few days. Before he could begin, a noise from the closet drew his attention. He turned to see Sierra pulling out a large box, her face lit with curiosity. Shaking his head, Ethan returned to the call, where his mom had shifted gears, excitedly talking about a national monument. "Isn't there a meteor crater in Winslow, Arizona? It's mentioned in some song, isn't it?" she asked. Without missing a beat, Ethan replied, "Yeah, in the Eagles' song, Take It Easy. It came out in 1972. His mom beamed with delight. "Oh, look at you, so knowledgeable," she said, unaware that Ethan had discreetly Googled the answer on his phone. Meanwhile, Sierra's rummaging caught Ethan's eye. "What did you find?" he asked. Sierra held up a pair of fuzzy handcuffs and restraints, her expression equal parts amused and incredulous. Ethan's jaw dropped as she burst out laughing. "Mom, what's this?" he asked, tilting the camera to show the find. His mom gasped. "Damn it, George," she yelled, addressing Ethan's father off-screen. "I thought you cleaned out the closet," a gruff voice replied. "You said you'd take care of that box and put it in the van yourself, remember?" Ethan's mom turned back to the camera, blushing furiously. "Well, dear, you see, sometimes moms and dads like to, be playful," she stammered, clearly mortified. "Mom," Ethan interrupted, smirking. "I know about the birds and the bees. You don't have to explain." After a long, awkward pause, his mom sighed. "Ethan, your father and I, well, we're older than you, but we're not dead. We enjoy our games. You understand." Ethan nodded, biting back a laugh. "Sure, Mom. Whatever makes you happy." The situation hung in the air for a moment before his mom cleared her throat. "Now, was there something you needed, or did you just call to embarrass me?" "Oh, right," Ethan said, his grin widening as he glanced at Sierra, who was still giggling over the discovery. "Can Sierra borrow a pair of your old jeans to go riding?" "Of course, dear," his mom replied quickly, eager to move on. "Tell her I hope she enjoys the ride." The situation grew even more awkward when Sierra handed Ethan a double harness she had pulled from the box. Ethan held it up to the camera, his brow furrowing in exaggerated curiosity. "And this? Care to explain, Mom?" Lena's face reddened as she glanced off-screen, where Ethan assumed George was sitting. "Well, darn," she muttered. "George, you should have reminded me about this box. I told you we needed to take it out." Ethan couldn't help but tease her further, relishing her embarrassment. "Mom, seriously, what else have you two been hiding?" he asked, smirking. The longer the conversation continued, the more he realized he didn't know much about his parents' private lives. He couldn't deny it. Lena and George were clearly a lively, loving, and evidently adventurous couple. As his mind wandered, a memory surfaced. Ethan recalled the time Aunt Janet had stayed the night at their house. Suddenly, it hit him. Janet wasn't his real aunt, just a close friend of Lena's. Or perhaps friend didn't fully describe their relationship. He looked at his mom, suspicion forming. "So, Mom," he started slowly, "when Aunt Janet came to visit that time, is she?" Lena fumbled for words, mumbling something incomprehensible. Her hesitation didn't confirm his suspicions, but it didn't deny them either. "Wow," Ethan muttered, leaning back in disbelief. "And when you sent me to the cabin for Dad's birthday, you and Aunt Janet were—" "Don't be rude, Ethan," Lena interrupted sharply, her tone maternal. "I won't, Mom. Promise." He paused, then added slyly, "But why?" Lena looked him square in the eye through the camera. "Because, young man, I have rules. When your father is pleased, so am I," she replied with unexpected bluntness. Ethan's jaw dropped. He was at a loss for words, his brain spinning from this sudden insight into his parents' personal lives. Before he could fully process it, Lena called out, "Hello, dear. Is my son treating you well?" Confused, Ethan froze. How could she know Sierra was with him? Sierra hadn't appeared on the screen, and she hadn't made a sound. "Son," Lena said knowingly, "remember, my full-length mirror is right behind you." Turning, Ethan saw the reflection in the old mirror. Sierra was clearly visible, standing in the doorway with an amused smile. With a heavy sigh, Ethan faced the camera. "Mom, meet Sierra." "Sierra, this is my mom." Sierra waved toward the mirror, then leaned in closer so the camera could capture her face. "Hello, Mrs. Singletary," she said cheerfully. Lena chuckled, her demeanor immediately warming. "Oh, sweetheart, after that conversation, I think we can skip the formalities. Call me Lena." "Yes, like in Star Wars," she added with a playful grin. While Lena and Sierra chatted, Ethan stepped back slightly. He was almost certain his mom couldn't see his left hand resting on the inside of Sierra's thigh, but he wasn't entirely sure if he needed to hide it. The dynamic had grown increasingly surreal. Suddenly, George's face popped into the frame. "Hello there," he greeted Sierra warmly before ducking out of view again. The last thing Ethan saw of him was his head disappearing below the edge of the table. "Mom," Ethan asked cautiously, "is Dad?" "Oh, darling," Lena said hastily, straightening in her seat. "I think it's time for us to go, okay?" She glanced at Sierra, adding, "It was lovely meeting you, dear. Be happy." With a quick tap of her keyboard, Lena ended the call, leaving Ethan and Sierra in silence. Ethan closed the laptop, turning to face Sierra with an incredulous expression. "You know," he began, smirking, "I think Mom wouldn't mind if you and Dad borrowed their toys someday." Sierra raised an eyebrow, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Are you sure about that?" "Absolutely," Ethan replied confidently. Sierra climbed onto his lap, kissing him softly, and Ethan felt all the awkwardness of the moment dissolve into the air. For the next few days, life at the ranch seemed idyllic. Ethan and Sierra grew closer, their connection deepening through shared moments both big and small. They worked together on the farm, cooked meals side by side, rode horses, and enjoyed each other's company. Ethan felt like they had found the perfect rhythm. But that harmony was disrupted one morning. Over breakfast, Sierra, who had been unusually quiet all morning, finally broke her silence. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "Darling." Ethan set down his coffee cup, concerned. "Yes? What's on your mind?" "You remember Clara, right? My friend from the city." "Of course," Ethan replied, nodding. "Why?" Sierra swallowed hard, fidgeting with her napkin. "Well, she's been going through a rough time lately. I was wondering, could we invite her to stay with us for a while? Would you mind?" Ethan blinked, stunned. Things between him and Sierra had been going so well, both in bed and out. Why would she invite someone who might complicate their dynamic? And yet, her phrasing struck him. She hadn't asked for Clara to stay with her. She'd said, "with us." That was an interesting distinction. After a moment of contemplation, Ethan forced a smile. "Of course," he said evenly. There was no sense in creating tension when things had been so perfect. Ethan knew that if Sierra didn't want to be alone with him anymore, nothing he could do would change that. Accepting the situation as it was seemed like the best course of action. But when Sierra's face lit up after he agreed to invite Clara, he realized how much her happiness mattered to him. "Thank you, darling. I'll call her," Sierra said, squeezing his hand. She pulled him closer as soon as the call connected, keeping him nearby as she began speaking to her friend. Ethan couldn't help but see this as a positive sign. "Hello, Clara," Sierra greeted warmly. The cowboy said yes, so everything's good. As the conversation continued, Ethan listened as Sierra discussed Clara's visit. She talked about games on the living room's wooden floor, horseback riding, and even the plane. At one point, Sierra rolled her eyes at Ethan, clearly amused by Clara's overexcited tone. "Clara, calm down," Sierra said, exasperated. "Just pack a few things. You won't need much. We're well prepared here." "Clothing? Not entirely necessary." She winked at Ethan, who chuckled softly. Once again, she used "we" to refer to both of them, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a warm sense of inclusion. "Wait a second," Ethan interrupted, motioning to get her attention. "Does she know how to get here?" Sierra sighed and shook her head. "No." "Well," Ethan began, smiling, "if she can make it to McSiri Aerodrome, we can pick her up in the Cessna." Ethan started giving directions, but Sierra stopped him with a laugh. "She has GPS." Dictating Clara's address, Sierra then turned to Ethan. "How soon can we get her?" Ethan glanced at the clock. "In a couple of hours, give or take," he said. The anticipation hung in the air as Ethan and Sierra prepared for Clara's arrival. Ethan couldn't shake the questions swirling in his mind. How would Clara's presence affect the idyllic dynamic he and Sierra had built at the ranch? Clara arrived just after the 2-hour mark. Sierra practically bounded to greet her, introducing Ethan with enthusiasm. They gave Clara a grand tour of the house and property. Ethan even introduced her to Ginger and his father's old horse, Hose. The girl spent most of the day by the pool, laughing and catching up, while Sierra skillfully pulled Ethan into their conversations, ensuring he and Clara could connect. Over the next 2 weeks, the trio fell into a pleasant rhythm. Mornings were spent tending to chores around the ranch, and afternoons were reserved for adventures. They swam in the pool, rode jet skis on the nearby lake, and found ways to make each day more fun than the last. Ethan cherished these weeks, especially the time he spent with Sierra. But it wasn't long before he began to notice the way Clara looked at Sierra, particularly when he flirted with her. One afternoon, Ethan accidentally stumbled across them kissing behind the shed. In that moment, everything clicked. Clara's feelings for Sierra were much deeper than friendship, and Sierra seemed conflicted. On the eve of the girls' departure, Ethan and Sierra lay in the dim light of the bedroom, their silhouettes illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. "You understand why I asked Clara to come, don't you?" Sierra asked softly. Ethan nodded. "Clara's feelings for you. She needed clarity, and you wanted to show her that nothing serious could happen between us." "I'm sorry it turned out this way," Sierra said, her voice laced with sadness. "I'm not angry," Ethan reassured her, pulling her closer. Sierra sighed, falling silent for a moment before continuing. "Do you remember the times we shared with Clara? The dances? And you understand why I have to leave?" Ethan nodded again. "You grew up together, started dancing at 4, and spent most of your life preparing for the tour in Philadelphia. It's only natural that special feelings would develop between you two. I saw you behind the shed, Sierra." Sierra stiffened. "I didn't want you to see that." "It's okay, Sierra. I understand." Sierra's voice wavered. "I've loved being here with you, Ethan. Maybe I could stay. Maybe I should reconsider everything." Ethan sighed heavily. "And Clara? How would she feel about that?" "I'd explain it to her. She'd understand," Sierra insisted. "No, darling," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but tender. "In Philadelphia, you have better opportunities than I could ever offer you here. I can't take away your dream. That wouldn't be fair." Tears welled in Sierra's eyes as she whispered, "I'll remember every moment I spent with you." "I will too," Ethan replied. Silence filled the room, heavy with unspoken emotions and the weight of what could never be. After the girls left, Ethan felt lost. The pain of parting was almost unbearable. To distract himself, he threw himself into preparations to sell the ranch. He sold all the cattle, horses, and bison. A particularly emotional moment came when he gifted 2 of the horses to the Ingram family. Their daughters, Emma and Sophia, cried tears of joy as they hugged Ethan, overwhelmed by his kindness. At an auction, Ethan sold off the rest of the ranch's equipment. He gave Uncle Frank's old Cessna to his friend Gina, hoping it would inspire the next generation of pilots at her flight school. Then, alone in the empty house, Ethan filled the pool with rocks and soil, determined to erase any reminders of the happy days he had shared with Sierra. Walking through the house one last time, Ethan meticulously checked every corner to ensure nothing important was left behind, except for the memories he would carry with him forever. After securing the necessary permits, Ethan set fire to the old ranch. The volunteer fire brigade stood by as the flames consumed the home where he had spent so much of his life. That night, he hosted a barbecue for the firefighters, ordering ribs, brisket, and other dishes from James. They laughed, ate, and shared stories until late into the night, when their spouses and loved ones called them home. Ethan spent the night alone in a small motel, feeling detached from the life he had just left behind. As he stared at the ceiling, he whispered to himself, "It's time for a new beginning."